so hard every day to protect New Zealand and New Zealanders. While no one can predict these types of scenarios, I am so very grateful and thankful that everyone on board returned safely and that environmental impacts have been able to be kept to a minimum. I will now hand over to Chief of Navy, Rear Admiral Golding, to talk you through the Court of Inquiry's initial findings.
Kia ora koutou, and thank you for joining us today. Today I'm going to announce what the Court of Inquiry has found happened in relation to the grounding and sinking of HMNZS Manawanui. The direct cause of the grounding has been determined as a series of human errors, which meant the ship's autopilot was not disengaged when it should have been. The crew was not aware that Manawanui remained in autopilot, and as a consequence, mistakenly assessed the ship's failure to respond to directional changes to the thruster controls as a thruster control failure. Having mistakenly assessed a thruster control failure, standard procedures should have prompted the ship's crew to check that the ship was in manual control rather than autopilot. This check did not occur. Remaining in autopilot resulted in the ship maintaining a course of 340 degrees towards land until grounding and eventually stranding. The purpose of this interim report was to establish what occurred, why it happened, and the what next in terms of lessons learned are still being worked on as part of a wider Court of Inquiry that will be completed in the first quarter of next year. Because of this, I may not be able to answer all of the questions you might have today, but I think it's important that we are as transparent as possible about what we know at this point in time. I will now talk through the overview of what the Court of Inquiry has found to have occurred. Evidence has been collected through the interviews with the crew and data from the ship's recordings. On Saturday, the 5th of October, 2024, HMNZS Manawanui was conducting survey operations on the southern side of Apia, Samoa. The weather at the time was a strong breeze of up to 25 knots and there was a moderate swell. The survey was conducted in a box-shaped area running west to east in survey lanes that start on the outside moving towards the reef. At about 6:15 p.m, Manawanui was conducting final runs of the inward box around half a nautical mile south of the Sinalei Reef, travelling at approximately 6 knots. The ship's crew attempted a routine turn to starboard to the right, initially to a course of 340 degrees within the survey area as part of a turn. The crew attempted to turn off the 340 degree course to the right towards an easterly course, but the ship did not respond as intended. Shortly after, Manawanui left the approved survey area, and in an effort to stop the ship, the crew conducted further actions that they believed should have resulted in the ship essentially stopping. Manawanui did not slow or stop, and instead accelerated towards the reef, grounding for the first time at or about 6:17 p.m. at a speed of more than 10 knots. The ship then travelled around 400 yards before becoming stranded, grounding multiple times along the way. Full control of Manawanui's propulsion system was not regained until 10 minutes later at 6:27 p.m. when the ship's autopilot was disengaged. The inability to turn and stop the ship is attributed to the ship being in autopilot mode. Unsuccessful attempts were then made to manoeuvre the ship off the reef. Manawanui was brought to emergency stations after the grounding, and searches were conducted to check for damage. No damage or flooding was detected inside the ship. However, stability assessments made after the grounding indicated Manawanui was no longer stable. The ship's angle of list its lean to the side, was approaching the limits for safe abandonment, and at approximately 6:46 p.m, around 30 minutes after the initial grounding, the decision was made to abandon ship. The timeliness of the decision to abandon ship and to keep the Manawanui's generators running contributed to the successful abandonment process and in all likelihood prevented serious injury or worse from occurring. At some point after the abandonment, the ship suffered a series of catastrophic fires before capsizing and sinking. The abandonment process and subsequent events will be covered in greater detail during Phase 2 of the Court of Inquiry. Because the Court has identified human error as the cause of the incident, a separate disciplinary process outside of the Court of Inquiry will need to be initiated. A separate disciplinary investigation will commence upon the conclusion of the Court of Inquiry, which is expected to be completed at the end of February. As well as the primary cause, there are also a number of identified contributing factors which made the ship's grounding more likely. These included areas around training, planning, supervision, readiness and risk assessments. These factors will be explored in more detail during Phase 2 of the Court of Inquiry. However, to provide some immediate assurance, we have conducted a series of audits in the fleet and looked to make improvements where these initial lessons from the interim report have been identified. At this point, I'd like to thank the Transport Accident Investigation Commission, the Royal Australian Navy, the Royal New Zealand Air Force for their contributions and support to the Court of Inquiry investigation. I want to reassure the public of New Zealand and Samoa that we will own it, fix it and learn from it. And I know it's on me as the Chief of Navy to earn back your trust. We have incredible people in the Defence Force who answer the call to serve every day. Much of their work is risky and decisions can be a matter of life or death. Nobody shows up to work to have a bad day. In this situation, we thankfully did not lose any lives. However, lives have been affected, and we will continue to support and work closely with those that were on Manawanui that day. Our priority is to continue to support the Samoan government with the response to this incident. I will now take questions acknowledging my earlier point where we are at with the investigation and the need to allow proper process to take place. This means I may not be able to answer all of your questions.
What do you think that this does for New Zealand's reputation on the world stage?
Well, obviously, this has had an impact to our reputation. That's where I said earlier that we need to own it, we need to fix it and learn the lessons. But at the same time that Manawanui incident occurred, we provided successful support to Samoa for CHOGM with Canterbury and Matatoa. We've had Aotearoa deploy to Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, and they just returned. And now they're out at sea today, preparing to go down to the Antarctic in support of Antarctic New Zealand. And we've got Te Kaha off the coast of Australia preparing for their mission to the Middle East next year. So we're out there doing things on behalf of our nation.
Can you categorically tell me that there is no fuel or oil, diesel currently coming out of that ship?
We've been very consistent in saying that there is a persistent slow leak coming from Manawanui, and we monitor it each day with our divers that are in place in Samoa.
What processes are you putting in place for compensation? The villagers and the chiefs are all demanding it now.
Yeah, the compensation side is a matter for the Samoan government, and we are supporting the Samoan government in that process.
Under standard protocol, how many people were responsible for checking if it was an autopilot?
On the bridge at the time, the main person, so I can probably help you run through that. So the autopilot, the person in charge or in control of the ship, would sit in a seat with the two thrusters that can operate the ship in manual. The autopilot is this panel here, so the officer in control of the ship at any stage could check on this panel whether the ship was in autopilot or not. Additionally, on the bridge was a supervisor who, at the time there was confusion, could have provided assistance at this stage.
And in this disciplinary process, how many people could be implicated?
At this stage, the disciplinary investigation, which will conclude on completion, will at this stage look at the officer who was in control of the ship, the officer that was supervising that person, and the commanding officer of the ship.
And was any of the crew aware that the grounding may have been a cause of human error?
I'm not unsure whether the crew is, but they would be privy to, as part of the investigation, has been undertaking interviews, etc. So.
And have you been reached out to Samoan government authorities, and what's their response been?
So we have provided a copy of this brief to our senior national representative, Commodore Andrew Brown, and he has already done some pre-briefing to the Samoan government and the High Commission in preparation for this announcement.
What was the Manawanui doing there in the first place, and did the Samoan government give authority for the ship to be in Samoa?
The ship was responding to a task in support of the Commonwealth heads of government to conduct a survey to the southern part of the island in support of that event.
Is weather and conditions one of the things that's going to be looked at as to whether the Manawanui should have been operating there at that particular time?
So they'd been conducting the survey for 22 hours. That's how long the survey. They were in their final parts of that survey. And as always, we'll continue to look at all factors that relate to the incident. But at this stage, human factor has determined the cause of the grounding.
Minister, if I may ask you, just what was your reaction to this news?
Well, I think we're all terribly disappointed about what happened and why it happened. We're taking this very, obviously, Navy is taking